America's defense strength comes from the people who build it. Welders, machinists, and others who produce the equipment our military relies on. And while demand is rising, the number of skilled workers hasn't. But the GE Aerospace Foundation and the company are stepping up. The foundation is launching a $30 million program to train 10,000 workers in advanced manufacturing. The program will expand instructor ranks, provide modern equipment, update courses to match industry credentials, and lower cost barriers, allowing graduates to step directly onto the line or into the hangar. These efforts are helping grow the skilled workforce the defense industrial base needs. Learn more at geaerospace.com/workforce.
I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio. On this, our 200th episode of the podcast, my colleague Patrick Tucker and I welcome back our very first guest on the show. Paul Scharre is the Executive Vice President at the Washington-based think tank, the Center for a New American Security. He's also a former Army Ranger and the author of several books, including For Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War. 2 years ago, Time magazine named Paul one of the 100 most influential people in artificial intelligence. Paul Scharre, it's been 7 years since we first spoke. Welcome back to Defense One Radio.
Well, thanks for having me back, and congratulations on such a successful, 200 episodes.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's been quite a lot. We've done a lot of varied formats, and I'm kind of proud of the work that we have done. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being a part of the very first day. All right. So, hey, actually going back to that time, back in 2018, to the extent that we at Defense One talked about artificial intelligence, it was largely through the lens of a pretty quiet Pentagon program at the time, a program with Google known as Project Maven. And as I understood it, the AI helped scan terabytes of drone and surveillance footage over the Middle East, for example, to assist in locating targets the U.S. military could strike during the war on ISIS. Now, one of the things I'd like to do in our discussion today is to tell the story of how the technology has evolved since then. So, to get us started, what more do you think it would be helpful to note about the understanding and use of AI in its infancy, back during the first term of President Trump, and perhaps even earlier if you like? We're basically just getting started, and then we'll kind of form a contrast with where we are now.
Yeah, so I think traveling backwards in time to these ancient times of 2018, what was just the technology was different. Not just that it was not as capable, but the AI systems that people were using at the time were qualitatively very different than large language models. And the deep learning revolution had kicked off around 2012 with some progress on ImageNet, image classification, dataset and challenge, using deep neural nets, so deep learning using neural networks to train neural networks on originally images to then build classifiers to identify objects, to identify that there are objects and then classify what those are. And that kind of brand of AI, classifiers, was really the bulk of AI systems, what you would call narrow AI, that we saw in that time frame. And the huge sea change that we've had over the last several years since then has been starting originally with GPT-2, which I think among the AI nerds drew a lot of attention, less so, in the global scale that ChatGPT did. A few years later, the development of large language models and increasingly general purpose systems. And it's not just that, okay, well, language models can generate text and that's interesting and useful. It's this really significant expansion of the scope of what AI systems can do, from doing one thing and doing it sometimes even better than people, whether it's identifying images or even back in the 90s, something like IBM's Deep Blue, which didn't use deep learning, but was able to play chess better than humans, beat Garry Kasparov, to today, much more general purpose systems that can do a whole wide range of tasks. And we can get into a whole thing of like, well, like how do you compare them against humans? And that's an interesting discussion, but it is a huge qualitative difference from, say, 7 years ago.
I want to kind of transition now to, of course, your most recent book. And that really kind of begins to set the stage for the bigger issues that animate the way that I think our audience interacts with this issue. And so in 2023, you published your book, Battlegrounds, about the AI tech race, which is kind of currently playing out largely between the US and China. So what can you share from that book, and what have you learned since about how we understand China is using this technology in its various applications?
Yeah, so I think, what motivated me in writing this book was discussions that had started underway in Washington, honestly, around the 2017, 2018, 2019 timeframe, kicked off in a big way with the National Security Commission on AI about this idea that, okay, the US and China are in this AI competition. We have to win, which, yeah, I think everybody in Washington agrees on, and generated a lot of ideas coming out of different quarters of think tanks, government, and commissions and other things about what we need to do. I wanted to take a step back and just try to understand, what are we competing in? Like what would it mean to compete in AI? What is the nature of that competition? And a lot of folks have compared AI to another industrial revolution. Okay, if you buy that comparison, and I think there's some validity to that, we saw that the industrial revolution led to major shifts in global power as some countries were able to capitalize on technology sooner and then translate that into not just economic, but also military power, but also that the key metrics of power changed. Coal and steel became key inputs of national power. Manufacturing capacity became a key measure of national power. Oil became a geostrategic resource that countries were willing to fight wars over. And so I wanted to understand, what was the nature of that competition in the age of AI? What are those things that we should be competing over? And at least this is tapered off a little bit, but there was a period of time where this idea of data is the new oil was all in vogue, and there were all these articles in The Economist, other places, data is the new oil, and you gotta wave about 9 months later of all these articles of data is not the new oil, data is not like oil. It's like, obviously it's not the same thing, but oil is valuable. Is data valuable? Yeah. Like, what's the similarities? What's the differences? But I wanted to take a step back and think more broadly. And so I think data is a key component of this competition, but clearly computing hardware is one. And that's one that we've seen heat up significantly since I published the book. In fact, the export controls on chips were coming down as the book was in the final stages of publication, and much to the publisher's dismay, I was starting to jam in updates and texted to new updates of U.S. export controls, which might have seemed arcane, but I was like, this is really important. We need to talk about this export control, this new NVIDIA chip, and that's become a big centerpiece of competition. And then I also talk in the book about the competition in talent, which is, of course, really critical. And then in institutions, and basically the mechanisms inside the U.S. military, inside the PLA, to take this technology that's really coming out of the commercial sector and pull it into the defense sector and then translate that to military advantage.
I remember this. This was at the beginning of the period where big data was like a hype term. And my publisher back in 2014 was like, everyone wants to talk about big data. And I'm like, yes, but you have to talk about basically the three things that are AI, which is just compute, data, and math. And the math, there are, people are coming up with new interpretations of ensemble models all the time, but it's really just derived from base. It's just really the alternative to basic regression statistics that allows you to constantly update. And all of these, every new algorithm has that as its father. The data is, this is the thing where Maven Light comes in. This is the entire point of it. You had a activity across the Middle East where the United States was collecting just hundreds and hundreds of hours of video footage, and that would go to analysts, and analysts would sit there and try to do a pattern of life and figure out which of the many people they were surveilling was the one that was going to put an IED somewhere. And that is very difficult and takes a long time and takes a lot of human resources. So there was a tipping and queuing sort of thing that was created to deal with the data. And that was later turned into big. And the compute thing is also really critical now. This is the dimension that AI competition is taking in terms of like a material competition for stuff that exists like on this planet. But I also think that the compute issue is one that we should. The military has a very particular sort of stake in it that is different from the way that great big consumer-facing foundation models understand compute. So they're building out massive data centers. They're getting lots of subsidies. They're trading like the same $100 million between themselves, based mostly on like data center stuff. And that's because of a premise that more compute and more data will help you just sort of scale up the performance of the foundation models. And while they did scale up faster than many people appreciated, faster than even Moore's law, there's some suggestion in that now that scaling just of that particular way of developing AI through large language models and stuff has plateaued. Like you're not seeing that in the same way. And this is, and you also see that there is a finite supply of like GPUs. But Google has entered, part of the reason there was a massive sell-off for NVIDIA, part of the reason Peter Thiel sold off all of his stuff is because Google has come up with an alternative. So there's going to be innovations there that keep pace, that you know turn that into a new fight every day. But the thing about the compute aspect of AI is that you have a situation right now where these really large public companies, these foundation models that provide a service that millions of people all around the world are constantly using, they're kind of sucking up a lot of the attention. They kind of are crowding out entirely different schools of and research areas and available GPUs that could go to a different version of AI, that's very critical for the military, but that the public doesn't really use at all. And that's like small AI. That's like on platform, not necessarily connected to big enterprise cloud, et cetera, AI, which I call small AI. And that, to me, is something that right now I don't see the Pentagon dealing with as well as they should, because actual warfare is going to need a combination of both of these types. And Paul can weigh in on this because he's a much more preeminent expert on it than I am. But future warfare is going to require both of these types of AI. We're going to need distributed, high autonomy that is not constantly connected to a cloud, that exists on platform, C3PO. That's your C3PO AI. Right. And you're going to need massive decision assistants that are also working through big problems in logistics and supply all of the time, reworking scenarios for what's dynamically changing on the battlefield, analyzing all of the data that's collected off of now everything on the battlefield and turning that into useful updates and at some point through agentic AI, actually like orders. You need them both. And the great big now Silicon Valley megafauna foundation model companies are kind of sucking some of the innovation space. They're sucking up the researchers. They're kind of determining the entire field of AI research around them to a certain extent. And they're sucking up a lot of chips. And that's actually a problem that I think that the Pentagon has to deal with because there's not a lot of consumer space right now. There's not a massive market for small AI, but there should be. There will be hopefully in the future.
No, I mean, I think this is such a critical point, the one that you're making, which is that both of these futures are real. And you'll hear this all the time, like you were saying, from companies. So, oh, the future is big models and ever larger and larger and larger, and more compute intensive models. And that's the future of AI. That's what we're certainly hearing from the leading labs. And then a lot of other companies that can't compete in that space. No, the future small models and it's too expensive and you can't do that. And like the reality is both of those things are true. There's some fascinating work done by the AI research group Epoch that's tracked a lot of the quantitative measurements in both scaling frontier models, but also in the sort of miniaturization, if you will, of models into more efficiency. And not only is there this exponential growth in the amount of compute being used in frontier models, and not just in training, but of course increasingly in the inference side as well, as we're seeing more compute used for inference, but there's also this pattern that we've seen, when it shows up in the data, of exponential improvements in the efficiency of models. So once a model comes out, so like GPT-4 hits the shelves, okay, so at the time that was the most advanced system. Then what we've seen in the data is 9 months later, there'll be a language model released by that company or somebody else that is able to achieve the same level of performance at half the amount of computing power.
Yeah.
And then 9 months later, after that, another half. So like the amount of computing power needed to achieve the same level of performance is halving every 9 months. Or even if those numbers move around a little bit, the point is you're seeing both of these trends. And so like the frontier of AI is needing more and more data and compute. But at any given moment, the amount of compute you need for certain level of capabilities drops really fast, makes it much more accessible. And so if you like sort of play that forward, you can envision a world where there might be, if this trend continues at the frontier, these like really expensive models to train and to run that are doing like really exquisite types of intelligence, maybe in scientific research, that are incredibly valuable. But on the other hand, we might see the commodification of sort of like routine day-to-day intelligence that's just good enough for a lot of what people are doing,
Yeah.
where the cost of that kind of intelligence drops pretty close to zero. Much
Yeah.
like if I get on Google search, like I don't have to pay for that. Like that, the cost of just accessing
Yeah.
through Google search information on the internet is like really, really low.
Yeah.
And so I think both of those things are real. And then there's a question of, okay, for an organization like the US military, like how do you harness all of those? Because you want it all,
Yeah.
and you want to feed it to warfighters and then let people play with it and figure out how do we turn that to warfighting advantage.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it also speaks to right now the business model of some of these larger companies. And when you want to understand what an AI bubble looks like, it looks like companies that are base their current valuation on reaching a sort of performance point and having lots of like data base agreements and new like data center agreements in play, and that's their way they justify their current valuation before they IPO or whatever. When in fact, yeah, to your point, like especially as the trend moves, as it obviously is, towards open source models, then that becomes, I think you'll see all of those that you were just talking about really accelerate, which is probably a very good thing for the United States military, but does suggest that there's some of the most innovative players right now really are in a position where they're sort of obliged to fight against actual innovation. And yet eventually have to, in order to keep going, sort of adopt that. So that's when OpenAI began to, after DeepSeek came out, which was basically a open source sort of ripoff of them, this is when they launched into an entirely new kind of direction where they partnered with like Sandia National Labs, and now they're partnering with the military to do exactly this, like custom make, like give them weights, give the military, give Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs the weights to their models, and then work with people on site that have very particular problems that are very complex. The U.S. military is a great example of that. And then work with them to run all of that on whatever that customer brings in terms of an energy capability, an energy source, and available data center. So they're actually making their big AI smaller too now, but it's only as small as like the military. So I see it's a fascinating space right now, but you see that like a lot of the way we think about some of this stuff at this moment, especially in terms of the valuation of some of these companies, is so transitory. It's moving like just so quickly.
I wanted to point out just two recent headlines that is to this point, and I'll let Paul or whoever wants to go from here. But they're headlines that I saw in the last 2 weeks, from late November, in The Economist. Investors expect AI use to soar, but that's not happening. And just last week in Futurism, the number of people using AI at work is suddenly falling. So I find those sort of trends kind of interesting, of course, in light of our conversations here. And of course, we've got two different paths that we're talking about, military and civilian. And these are, of course, civilian applications. Yeah. But I find those fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember back when like in like 2002, everyone was like, God, the internet is nothing but like a weird site where you can buy secondhand, like, Pez dispensers and stuff. Like this hype thing is crazy right now on this. Yeah. Like it's bullshit, man. I'm not even going with it. And it turns out that people actually did figure out new stuff to use it for. But it's what I like about what the DoD is doing right now is they under research and engineering, they are moving out with new, basically just tools that are available to everybody, so that people can figure out how to build a relationship with AI on a very like day-to-day, person-to-person, like person-to-machine thing. And that's kind of unique to the U.S. military's approach to AI that gives me, and I hopefully the free world, some reassurance about the way the U.S. is developed and uses AI in military constructs as opposed to China or Russia or autocratic state.
Yeah. I mean, I think like if you pull a thread on what you were talking about here about this rapid proliferation of the technology, whether it's, DeepSeek or some other kinds of models, Alibaba also releasing models out of China. To me, one of the takeaways is that even if US labs stay right at the forefront of this technology, Chinese labs are like single digit months behind. And whether that's like 2 months or 9 months, I'm not sure that at the end of the day, it translates that lead alone translates to a meaningful military advantage if the Pentagon is charitably 5 years behind the frontier, right? And so my takeaway is, yeah, great that we have U.S. companies in the lead, and we want to be building out infrastructure, and the energy is supported, and that's all good. But we've got to find ways to rapidly translate that technology into some kind of actual military advantage. And that, putting it in the hands of warfighters is really great. I'm glad to see the military moving out on that. But it requires this iterative. I mean, one of the things that's very clear looking at historical examples of disruptive technologies is giving people the widget is not enough. That it requires people to figure out how to use it effectively. It requires people to transform their military operations around that, oftentimes in ways that are culturally uncomfortable, and that's going to be hard. And I think that's a longer term process, and it's one that I think we should be realistic about the fact that we are competing on a pretty level playing field against the PLA.
Yeah.
And like in order to win that competition, we're going to have to find ways to actually be innovative and bring in the tech and be disruptive inside the US military in ways that, are sometimes going to break China and people are going to like. But that's what's going to take to maintain a military advantage.
America's defense strength comes from the people who build it. Welders, machinists, and others who produce the equipment our military relies on. And while demand is rising, the number of skilled workers hasn't. But the GE Aerospace Foundation and the company are stepping up. The foundation is launching a $30 million program to train 10,000 workers in advanced manufacturing. The program will expand instructor ranks, provide modern equipment, update courses to match industry credentials, and lower cost barriers, allowing graduates to step directly onto the line or into the hangar. These efforts are helping grow the skilled workforce the defense industrial base needs. Learn more at geaerospace.com/workforce.
All right, so let me, if I may, piggyback off that into the one setting where it is very clear there is, both in terms of like the small kind of on-platform AI, and also even at this point like larger uses of AI, and that is the Ukrainian battlefield, where Ukraine and now Estonia are moving out on a new concept of like government that employs agentic AI. They're basically redesigning aspects of all government processes, realizing that civil defense and the resilience of normal day-to-day life is kind of is like an essential thing that's an aspect of security, especially if you're under attack. And so they're going to use large-scale and agentic AI to do government service in a lot of ways, which is not a hard military thing, but is connected to security. It's not something we could do in this country because people have really bad feelings or sentiment towards government and government AI. But they have in Estonia and in Ukraine a very different relationship with the government, and I think that's fascinating. But on the other end, here's a good example. Like last couple of weeks ago, the Pentagon and CENTCOM announced that they had deployed a squadron of Shahed kind of knockoff drones and these are high maneuverable, basically one-way attack, but they're maneuvering. They're actually, they have on board an intelligence, and we want to use them not just for strike, but for ISR. But the fact that we're now doing like copycats of Iranian equipment that we wouldn't even have access to if a bunch of guys on the battlefield of Ukraine hadn't picked that thing up, then reverse engineered it themselves, and then created a specific drone that's specific for like defeating Shaheeds. And then they gave this to us, and now we're crowing as though this is the hallmark of innovation that we copied an Iranian design. So, like to get to your point about why it's so important to actually have real use cases, real deployments, not just play school in like relationship with AI. When you look at how it is used right now in the context of Ukraine, particularly by Ukrainians? Is the U.S. Paying attention to those lessons well enough? How do they better exploit that relationship in a way that is favorable to both? I mean, how do you actually bring value to the relationship rather than exploit? Exploit is a bad word for it. And where do you see in all of this like weird geopolitical mess of a conversation that we're having right now about Ukraine? And we don't have to get too much into politics, but are we in danger of losing or damaging a relationship that is truly critical for us to actually innovate in this field?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me take at least the first chunk of that, and then we can circle back on it. I mean, I think Scharre, your reaction to this point about us basically doing a knockoff of these Iranian drones, which is on the one level, okay, great, we're learning from others, and we should be willing to take lessons that we can find them, but also, like, come on. I mean, we ceded the advantage here. And I'm glad that we see the U.S. military and the broader kind of U.S. defense ecosystem waking up to the potentials of drone warfare based on what we've seen in Ukraine. That's better than people completely ignoring it. But we're way too reactive. Way too reactive. All of the things that we're seeing unfold were not only foreseeable, they were foreseen by many people, including yourself and me and other experts, Mike Horowitz, many other people who were writing on this like a decade ago and talking about the potentials of drone warfare. And I remember these conversations, 12, 13 years ago, where you'd have a couple of voices in the wilderness saying, like, drones are the future, this is coming, and hearing from senior military officials just this really narrow conception of drones. Well, in order to use drones, you need satellites. And not everybody has satellites. It's like, that's how the Air Force does it. That's not how the Army did it with their Gray Eagle drones back then. Like, that's one way of doing it. You need all this intel analysts doing the PED on the back end. Like, no, that's one way of doing it. That is not the only way of doing it. And I think you see that repeated. I see that repeated again in conversations within the U.S. defense ecosystem about Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to sound too cranky about this, but
hit it.
It kind of makes me mad, right? Because it's like, because at the end of the day, we're putting our military advantage at risk. What I hear people say is that, well, like, drones are a big deal. We need to get these drones. And then the response I'll hear is like, well, you're not going to fly these quadcopters across the Pacific. Like, obviously not. Obviously not. Okay. Now you might fly them across the Taiwan Strait. You could put really small drones on Taiwan. Okay. But also the wake up call should be that we are the system, the Pentagon, the services, chunks of industry are thinking about the future of warfare far too narrowly. And we need to broaden our aperture for how we think about this technology and what it's capable of doing. And we need to lean in to the possibilities here. And it may not be that particular platform that's relevant in future wars, maybe. But the idea that like a triple mass doesn't work, like, no, it does. We can clearly see that it does. Drones are going to be valuable in the future. We want to be at the forefront of that. And I think we need to be much more willing to explore capabilities and concepts of operation that are outside the comfort zone for the services.
Yeah. And Ukraine is an example of they have to do it by virtue of necessity. And that's part of the reason why the relationship is like really important. But one of the other things that Ukraine sort of teaches us, and it is, and there are ways to apply, I'm sure, a large foundation model to this problem. Or not. There's no such thing as air dominance over Ukraine. There's no air superiority, which is why it's like stop. It's why it's like in this World War I mode. And drones did that. Like just the mass of consumer drones did that, and that's because Ukraine figured out how to 3D print them close to the front line. But Russia also has a massive supply chain from China that allows them to continue with that, and that has resulted in this weird stalemate where there's no air superiority. So, what are the things when you look at the Pacific specifically. In terms of how you would apply AI into that theater, taking everything that we've learned about the specifics of the Ukrainian battlefield, how do we then apply those in a different context to create long-range attributable strike, which is what we're trying to do, and INDOPACOM's trying to do that under a program. But there's other things that they need to do too that maybe they're not doing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so actually, I want to take a moment, just take a beat on one issue that I think is really key that comes out of the Ukraine war, which is not about a specific capability, it's about time. So when I was in Ukraine last year and I met with their drone operators and drone developers and the head of their drones and their armed forces, one of the things that I repeatedly heard from them was the importance of them compressing this time cycle between war fighters, what's happening on the front lines, and the drone developers. And we spoke with the head of their drones for their armed forces, and they were, I mean, before we lost, they were pretty critical of U.S. drones.
Yeah, they think it's junk. They think our stuff is junk. They're like, we will take them because we will shoot them at the adversary, but this is not exactly the best drone I've ever seen.
Right? They didn't like it. And so I asked them, so, well, what's wrong with the U.S. drones? And the feedback was fundamentally that the U.S., for a variety of reasons, is not able to innovate on time cycles that are relevant enough. And so what I heard from them, example of, okay, U.S. company finally gets approval to get something out to the battlefield in Ukraine. They use it. It doesn't work at some reason. The frequencies are getting jammed, whatever. There's obviously a lot of electronic warfare going on the front lines. They get the feedback, take it back, 12 months before the company's got to iterate on it and then jump through a bunch of, in fairness to industry, a bunch of hoops in government to do test and evaluation and get it approved, to send it back overseas. And that's just not fast enough to be useful. And I talked to drone developers who were chatting in real time with the companies that were using their technology on the front lines and making changes right there in their warehouses as they're building the technology. And so that's, how do we translate that idea to our system for future conflicts, whether that's a conflict against China or other ones? How do we compress these time cycles of development and make it easier for us to adapt on the fly? And that's going to be really critical both when we're preparing for future conflicts, but also once we're in a war. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Some stuff is going to work, some of it's not. The enemy's going to be adaptive. We're going to have to adapt on the fly quickly. And we did a lot of this actually in Iraq and Afghanistan, in ID defeat, in ISR task force, MRAP task force. But one of the things that strikes me is in all of these examples, we had to go outside the traditional system. We had to create standalone organizations or task forces, in many cases that reported directly to the Secretary of Defense in order to move at a time cycle of relevance. And so we're going to have to find ways to shake up our system in order to move faster to stay competitive with the way this technology is moving in future conflicts.
Yeah, and they're trying to do some of that, right? There's this bunch of new directions that the Pentagon has taken. There's the memo that requires preference for consumer dual-use software, which means that you have to buy stuff that's already there. There's the one that pushes a lot of authority, particularly for drones, down to the battalion level. To the acquisition executive is actually a guy that does the shooting, or at least they have a lot more input. There's the most recent one. What else can they be doing that they should be doing now in order to speed up those time cycles? And do you think we were talking about? So I'll leave with that, and then I'll get back to the AI question of it.
Yeah, I do think that this leadership team in the Pentagon, to their credit, is very invested in shaking things up and moving faster and clearing on some of the red tape. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a big piece of this that's got to happen on Capitol Hill as well, and Congress has got to be supportive. Some of that has to do with just like things like getting less control out of the appropriators and giving the Department of Defense or War or whatever call it these days, the flexibility to spend money very fast and be flexible in how they move money around. I think that's really important. It also requires something of a shift in mentality of, when we buy something, how long are we planning on buying this for? Yeah. And I think it depends a lot on what we're investing in. The Army, several years ago bought a new handgun. okay, if you're buying a new handgun in the army, that's pretty stable technology. We could buy that handgun and keep it for a very long time. We can be somewhat deliberative in the process. But if you're talking about cheap expendable drones, we need to be willing to acknowledge we might invest in this system or electronic warfare systems, other ones, and 5 years might be obsolete.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Now, that might change then your strategy, that it might be more that I'm going to buy things in small batches and field them to units to experiment with, take it out in the field, and sort of bake in options to scale production quickly if it turns out, hey, we go to war or we see that anticipating and we need to do it. It's sort of a different way of thinking about how long you're going to buy something. Just like, if you buy a car, you might plan to keep it for a long period of time. If you buy an iPhone, you're not going to keep that thing for 10 years, realistically, right? That's going to be too outdated. And so I think that's going to have important implications for how the military actually spends.
Yeah. So on that, I wanted to get back to like the other thing that the U.S. maybe has or is going to play a part in the U.S. maybe creating something like parity and or hopefully dominance in the event of like a large-scale future conflict that obviously will involve drones and innovating the drones on the front line. But that innovation cycle, that's the entire point of some of these AI models that we're all using. It's supposed to be cut like, your OODA loop at work. It's supposed to be helping you do that, like scale up yourself and your talents so that you can do things faster. And when you think about, not everybody is going to want to be on an island in the Pacific and then trying to connect to a cloud to use the military version of ChatGPT. There might be room for some of that, but a distributed kind of personalized version of a large-scale foundation. What today we experience as ChatGPT, scaled down to that person, scaled down to that entity that has to figure out this new drone problem, this new robot problem really quickly. That's a potential game changer. Is that something we have unique advantage on, or is this something that's also going to be very rapidly democratized in terms of use? Because that kind of puts a lot of trust in the NCO. And that's not something that the Chinese or the Russian military historically have done.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I'd say it's potential sources of advantage here for the United States, but we have to harness them and use it in a certain way. So one is actually just in the computing hardware itself, in the chips. We do have a huge advantage here over China, partly because of NVIDIA, but ultimately it's because of actually TSMC and the fact that they rely on U.S. software and U.S. tooling and equipment to make these chips that are only made in Taiwan, which is like actually where the sort of real choke point lies on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment side. And I think that's one really critical, that we're making the right moves to sustain that advantage over the long term. And so while there's a lot of debates around, which chips should we allow export to China, I think that's actually quite important of a conversation to have. The most important thing is on the manufacturing equipment side and sustaining those export controls to China so that they are dependent on chips externally. And I think that's like absolutely super critical. And then there's a question of like, well, how much compute should we allow them to have? And I think we want to probably the most sensible position would be to be exporting chips that are just a little bit better than what they can make domestically to help suppress the domestic market inside China. But there's a pretty healthy gap between what China has and what the US has, so we can seize on that advantage. For the military standpoint, then, boy, the military's got to be moving really fast in terms of finding ways to use this computing power, because if they're like 5 or 10 years behind the leading edge in terms of computing power, then it probably doesn't really matter. But then the other side is, on the cultural piece, I think that is potentially a huge source of advantage for the United States. We already are in a place where we delegate a lot of this authority to junior officers and NCOs. I think what's particularly powerful here is it's not just baked into the culture of the U.S. military relative to the PLA, but it's actually baked into the culture of like the American system in a way that's much more entrepreneurial and much more just freedom for people to innovate and be creative than inside China. That's not to say that you can't have, particularly on the tech side, a lot of innovation. I think we've seen actually over the last 25 years that that's very possible in China. But there's also a very strong authoritarian streak in the country that we've seen under Xi, the CCP cracking down on. That's, in some ways, from a geostrategic advantage standpoint, I think probably actually to the U.S. advantage, because I think in the long run that's going to have effects to hinder China. So then how do we actually capitalize on that, right? So we've got to be putting that technology in the hands of our warfighters, our junior officers, our NCOs, and allowing them to grab a hold of it and then use it effectively.
So I got kind of two questions that pick up on points that you and Patrick had flagged. And the first, Paul, you've been working out of DC for a while. Do you, and you have mentioned Congress a time or two in this discussion, do you worry that U.S. lawmakers are behind the curve in any particularly concerning ways when it comes to this, this AI kind of tech race we've been talking about?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we don't have the tech literacy that we need in Congress in order to stay on top of this technology. Now, in fairness, the technology moved super quick. Lots of places people don't have the tech literacy. But I think there's probably true in a lot of companies where companies are trying to figure out what is this AI and how do I use it, and how do we use it effectively. And I've been super impressed by the level of energy that we've seen out of Congress since really the Chat GPT moment a few years ago, where we had lawmakers, holding hearings and inviting tech leaders to come in and get smart on this quickly. And in a lot of my personal interactions, I mean, there's a lot of members and staffers that I interact with who are clearly deeply knowledgeable. What's hard, of course, is translating that to lawmaking and regulation, or what is the role of Congress effectively? We see debates, for example, around preemption right now, and states like California moving forward on regulation in the absence of federal regulation. I don't think anyone believes, for example, that having 50 different regulatory regimes in the United States is a good thing. Nobody wants that. That would really kill innovation. On the other hand, that's not the alternative being proposed. Right now, we see the federal government doing nothing in terms of regulating this technology. And I'm just not sure politically that's going to fly with the American people, who are worried about their jobs. They're worried about surveillance tech. They're worried about child safety. There are a lot of concerns that people have that are actually pretty valid and pretty legitimate that we've got to work through as a society. And Congress probably has a role to play in some of these issues, in delivering funding for things that are going to be really critical for sustaining national advantage, whether that's in computing hardware or military spending or R&D, but also for managing what, if the technology delivers and everything that these proponents say it's going to do, is going to be probably a good amount of societal disruption. And we're going to have to find ways to navigate that as a society to make sure that A is actually beneficial for everyone.
Do you think there's anything useful to be said about the race to build new data centers all across the country? I was just looking at a map today from a source called DC Byte, and it showed Virginia had the densest cluster of these, and there were lots of others in Georgia, Ohio, and Texas, and other states in the southern U.S. So I'm kind of curious, what, if at all, what's been the conversation around this topic at your level?
Well, it's funny. I think that no matter what AI is doing, people are critical. So right now, there's so much spending on AI and the build out of data centers that the concern is there a bubble and this is overbuilding and there's not going to be demand for this? Now, look, maybe that's true. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I think some of the circular financing deals, as just like a layperson, look a little squirrely, but what do I know? I would observe certainly that when people are comparing things to the dot-com bubble, and when that burst, the dot-com crash, yeah, that definitely happened, but the internet turned out to be real. And so I do think over the long run, whether there's a bubble or not, or whether there's a crash or not, that making a long-term bet on AI is probably pretty sound. This technology is quite likely to continue to mature. There's just sort of a more near-term question of, okay, will some of these AI companies that are scaling up very rapidly and taking on, making a lot of spending like OpenAI, are they going to be able to generate enough revenue to satisfy investors? I'm not sure about that. On the one hand, you could look at it and say, well, the math doesn't add up, and lots of people have kind of tried to do these calculations. On the other hand, there's a lot of investors that people, boy, wish they had gotten in on the ground floor of Netflix and Amazon and Facebook. And I think that is driving a lot of this investment, the potential of the technology. I will say that it's interesting to hear this conversation right now about, oh, we're building too many data centers, when a year ago, what I was certainly hearing from all of the AI experts worried about maintaining U.S. advantages, we're not building enough data centers. China's going to outbuild us. And so I would, when I think about national advantage, it's hard to know exactly how to calibrate this. I do think it is valid that computing hardware is going to be the key thing that makes the difference between the US and China in terms of national advantage. And you can think about computing hardware and data centers as sort of the equivalent, make a comparison here, not identical, but a comparison, to manufacturing capacity during the Industrial Revolution. And just like we saw actually, the US and others retool manufacturing plants during World War II to start cranking out military types of production, that similarly, having data centers, having computing hardware, having chips will be really critical for national advantage, both in the sense of advancing AI, in the sense of applying AI across society for economic productivity and growing industry, and then, if necessary, in certain areas, applying that to military advantage or to national security applications, say like intelligence or cybersecurity. And so I'm actually pretty happy that we have this massive build out. I was worried a year ago that we wouldn't see this level of growth. Obviously, if this all comes crashing down, that won't be great,
Right.
From an economy standpoint or from a national competitive standpoint. But it's an interesting shift from even like 3 years ago or so. You had AI experts saying these companies are talking about AGI but the market isn't reacting as though AGI is coming around the corner, and they should be. And now we see the market's reacting, and then people don't like that. But I think, AI is coming, and I'm glad actually to see companies, investors responding to the potential of this technology.
Yeah. Well, we've mentioned Ukraine, and we've talked, of course, about Russia, China. It's kind of a big picture question, but I do wonder, how do you think AI can help democracies, or do you think it's a bit of an unhelpful distraction to try to even link those two concepts at all?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think you could imagine things that would be troubling if you got really extreme concentrations of power in companies that are to a larger scale than the kind of winner take all dynamics that we already see in different aspects of digital tech. In operating systems and handsets and social media platforms, for example, today. So if you ended up where there's just one or two companies that are dominant, that dwarfs in a scale far beyond what we're seeing today, that probably would worry from a concentration of power standpoint. A lot of the things that I've seen or worried about or see potential advantages of are much more second order. I think certainly the types of surveillance tech that we're seeing China pioneer and export around the world are troubling for democracy. But I think we've seen in the United States that we haven't just blindly used AI, throughout the country so far to create a new surveillance state, which is encouraging. There's actually, around things like public cameras and AI surveillance in that context, pretty healthy and robust debate inside the United States, and sometimes a grassroots movement against, for example, public surveillance tech using AI coming out of cities and states. And I think that give and take is really important to get responses that are good from a democratic standpoint. That having a dialogue between individuals and companies and the government at the federal level and state level and local level and grassroots movements and civil society and media, that's messy, but that's going to get a better outcome in the long run. Obviously, there are some wild cards out there, like labor market disruption, that could change the game significantly. And maybe it'll turn out that AI will be more like other types of technologies in the past, like the shift from farms to factories. And okay, sure, like all the labor that was previously working in agriculture got displaced by the Industrial Revolution, but there were new jobs that were created, and we'll be fine. They'll be true for AI, or maybe it'll be different. The Industrial
Sure.
Revolution did put horses out of business, and maybe we'll end up like horses, and there just won't really good reasons for humans to perform labor in the economy. And that's a thing where, like, okay, we'd have to navigate that as a society. And so I'm not sure, but I think it's what's going to be important is having ways in society to work through these challenges to ensure that we're the benefits of this technology, however they materialize, are going to be broadly beneficial and not just benefit a few.
Yeah. All right, my very final question, and again, thank you for taking so much time to talk to us, by the way.
Of course.
On a departing and much lighter note, are there any films or TV shows in recent years that, for you, have addressed issues related to AI in compelling or, perhaps even hilariously misleading ways? I'm curious.
Oh, so my little hobby horse on this is that I think that the way that we often talk about AI is too anthropocentric. It's too much centered on the idea of a human-like type of AI system. Even conversations around AGI is like, why do we think that AI is moving in the direction of something that looks like human intelligence? My suspicion is that what we're likely to find, I think we're seeing elements of this already as AI improves, is that intelligence is not like a staircase where you move from ants to dogs to chimpanzees to humans and AI moves up the staircase, but much more like this vast space of possible intelligences, of which humans are one that was specialized for a certain type of evolutionary niche that we fit into, and then AI is probing the space, and that even large language models that generate text that is human-like, because we trained it that way, under the hood, the way they're functioning is quite different and quite alien. And so I sort of don't like things that have AI systems or robots that like sort of feed into this anthropocentrism. And I love things that make AI seem kind of alien and weird. One of my favorite, I'm going to spoil something here, so like spoil alert for viewers. One of my favorite is the movie Ex Machina, where like the whole premise is you see this robot and you know it's a robot and can it pass the Turing test of convincing someone that it's like a person, which is kind of intriguing. But there's this great moment at the end where I think it was Ava was the name, or where the robot character basically like turns on a dime and turns against the humans. And I think what I like about that is not only it's very well presented, it's very chilling, but it really drives home the idea that our mental models for intelligence and how we deal with other human beings are not only not necessarily going to work out like well for AI, but might really set us up for failure in a way that's quite catastrophic, because we have all of this internal mental machinery that allows you and I to have this conversation, us to meet strangers on the street, interact with people in all of the social settings that we have in our lives. And it works out super great. But those mental models that we use, if we apply them to AI and we sort of anthropomorphize the machine, might be really quite dangerous. Yeah. And I think that's, we've been seeing, I mean, not that we've seen large language models behave necessarily in that way, but we've seen glimmers of that with large language models where they'll do strange, bizarre things that I think allow us to see that beneath this thin veneer of human-like presentation, what's going on under the surface is quite alien and weird. And I think that's an idea that we want to hold on to as the technology continues to evolve.
Well, Paul Scharre is the Executive Vice President at Center for New American Security in Washington. Paul, thank you so much for speaking with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back on the show. Very excited.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening. And until next time.
America's defense strength comes from the people who build it. Welders, machinists, and others who produce the equipment our military relies on. And while demand is rising, the number of skilled workers hasn't. But the GE Aerospace Foundation and the company are stepping up. The foundation is launching a $30 million program to train 10,000 workers in advanced manufacturing. The program will expand instructor ranks, provide modern equipment, update courses to match industry credentials, and lower cost barriers, allowing graduates to step directly onto the line or into the hangar. These efforts are helping grow the skilled workforce the defense industrial base needs. Learn more at geaerospace.com/workforce.